Good evening. The webinar will start in 2 minutes.
Hello and welcome to this evening's webinar on dyslexia support and dyslexia-friendly schools for parents, carers and anyone affected by dyslexia. Just to let you know that if you wish to use closed captions or subtitles, you can click on the CC button in the bottom corner of your screen, which will turn on closed captions and subtitles for the speaker's words. You can change the caption language, select settings, caption subtitles and choose the language you would like. Unfortunately, this function isn't available on the Teams app for mobile. Also, just be aware that this webinar is being recorded, but there's no video or audio coming from the attendees. I'd now like to introduce Alison and Rachel, who are specialist advisory teachers for special educational needs with Wiltshire Council, and they will be taking you through today's webinar.
Thank you, Fiona. So, in this session, we will be covering these 4 areas. Firstly, what is dyslexia? Then, how schools can support dyslexia and literacy difficulties, followed by some of our top tips for you to try at home. And finally, we'll be giving you some information about the support available for those with dyslexia within Wiltshire. Go to the next slide, please. So, making sense of dyslexia, what is it? It may actually surprise you to know that there is no nationally agreed definition for dyslexia within England, but the definitions that are most widely used are broadly similar. So the things that we know about dyslexia are that it is a learning difference. It's often characterised, particularly these days, by widely acknowledged strengths in areas such as big picture thinking, spatial skills, 3D visualization, problem solving, things like that. But many of us know that dyslexia comes with a lot of challenges as well. We know that dyslexia goes across all abilities, so it doesn't mean that somebody is of low ability because they have dyslexia. It also doesn't mean that they are of high ability because they have dyslexia. It is characterized by difficulties with reading and spelling, and it's evident when accurate and fluent reading and spelling develop very incompletely or with great difficulty. Characteristic features of dyslexia are difficulties with processing sounds, applying them and using them at speed, And we might also see co-occurring difficulties. So that could be language difficulties, perhaps some difficulties with remembering things, mental calculation, concentration, personal organisation, and maybe with our coordination as well. But all of these things are not themselves markers of dyslexia. So if we can go to the next slide, please.
Thank you. Something else to think about with dyslexia is that we think it takes people who are dyslexic much longer to become automatic at doing things. And sometimes that can be quite significant. So things like learning to recognise words by sight, learning to recall facts by heart, things like that might take a lot longer than we may expect to learn by heart and to become automatic at those things. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a little bit about what dyslexia might look like from a child's perspective, what we might see in an individual child. So bearing in mind that all children and young people are different, everybody is likely to experience differently, although there are those common patterns and themes that Rachel has described already. So we may see in school difficulties with learning and using phonics. So that might be one of the first things that we spot, it being different. Learning phonics, using phonics, remembering key words in reading and spelling, processing and remembering information at speed. So, for example, remembering instructions, that's something that we often see in schools, something that parents and carers often tell us that they see as well at home. Learning facts by heart, I mentioned earlier, and there's quite a lot of expectation in schools that children will learn some things by heart, like, for example, multiplication facts. So for some children, that might be a little bit more difficult. Organisation is something that we might see some children find difficulty with. So, for example, when they move, particularly to secondary school, remembering the things that they need for different lessons and the things that they're becoming automatic at remembering what they need each day. As Rachel mentioned, there might be some overlaps with other difficulties. So things like visual sensitivities that Rachel will talk about in a moment, possibly coordination, possibly attention, concentration, and language. And I think we're a lot more aware these days of those overlaps than perhaps we were going back a decade or so. But what I'd really want to stress is that every child is different, and crucially, every child will have strengths. We'll talk more about that later on today. As Rachel said, it's not linked to ability, so that's really important to be aware of. It's about learning and thinking differently, and difference can be good as well. Again, more about that later on today. Also being aware that every child has a different experience at school and at home, and those are things that can impact positively and otherwise sometimes on learning. And as I said, every child has strengths. We need to find out more about those strengths, help celebrate those strengths, help children find their strengths and use those strengths to help us understand how to support children further. So thinking about dyslexia, if we go to the next slide, we often wonder, what is the incidence of dyslexia? Well, dyslexia is something that we're likely to see in every class. So most classes will include some children who are likely to be dyslexic. And the British Dyslexia Association estimates that around 10% of the population are dyslexic. I'm going to the next slide. Rachel's going to tell us a little bit about visual sensitivities and difficulties, which often get confused with dyslexia.
Thank you, Alison. So we often get asked these questions, what about visual difficulties? And do all dyslexics experience visual difficulties? And the short answer is no, they don't all experience visual difficulties. There seems to be a little bit of a myth that perhaps everybody does have visual difficulties if they're dyslexic, or that's a key indicator of dyslexia. So are they a key indicator of dyslexia? Again, no. The short answer is visual difficulties are not a key indicator of dyslexia. And do all dyslexic learners need an overlay or coloured paper? Again, the short answer would be no, because not all dyslexic people will experience visual difficulties. That's not to say that they won't at all. So research suggests that around 1 in 5 individuals with dyslexia may experience something called visual stress, which is what we talk about when we talk about letters and words moving on the page, and a difficulty with the high contrast between the black and the white on the page. But that still means that 80% of dyslexics typically would not have those same difficulties. And so in the past, it was thought that visual stress and dyslexia and visual difficulties in dyslexia were very strongly associated. But in more recent years, that's found not to be the case. And in Wiltshire, we would agree with Professor Arnold Wilkins, who stated in 2016, the majority of those diagnosed with dyslexia do not experience visual stress, and there are many individuals with visual stress who can read quite normally and are not considered to be dyslexic. It is time to dissociate visual stress from dyslexia and consider it as a separate condition, but it can be one that individuals may have as well as dyslexia. So hopefully that helps to clear that up a little bit. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Alison will tell you a little bit more about how we make sense of dyslexia within Wiltshire.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do within our team. So we're the specialist SEN service, and we're a team of specialists, including specialist teachers, and we're available to support and give advice to all maintained schools within Wiltshire. Within Wiltshire, we use guidance from expert groups, as Rachel mentioned earlier, to recognise dyslexia. We take what's known as a graduated response to learning needs. So the graduated response is a phrase you may often hear talked about in relation to special educational needs, and it's part of the special educational needs code of practice, and often known as the assess, plan, do, review cycle approach. So we follow that graduated approach, as do our schools. And most importantly, what we do is look towards thinking what can make a difference. So giving advice to support children. We do recognise dyslexia as an educational identification. It isn't a medical diagnosis, so it isn't something that you would go and talk to the doctor or the GP about. We do within our team recognise dyslexia. We do talk about dyslexia a lot, as indeed we are tonight, talking about it very openly. And as part of our work, we may carry out some assessments sometimes. Sometimes that is appropriate. And we do recognise that sometimes it can be helpful to know whether there may be some signs of dyslexia. But crucially, what I want to stress is that what we do in our team is needs-led. So we're focusing on the individual child or young person, and we're looking at practical, evidence-based, realistic, workable approaches that are likely to be important and effective for the individual. We work with schools to help them develop these approaches and to develop effective dyslexia-friendly practice. The key messages that we give are that identification of dyslexia should follow that graduated response of assess, plan, do, review. So ideally, it's not about going in and doing an assessment and making a judgment without taking in lots of other factors as well. It's also looking at children, young people's response to the support and intervention they've had, particularly over time. Because the system that we work with is needs-led, we're focusing on the child or the young purpose. So our focus is about helping find out about strengths and also needs or areas of difficulty, which can then give us more focus and help us shape our advice to schools to help schools understand and know perhaps how to better support children and young people. As part of our work, we might sometimes carry out some assessments which may indicate whether the child has a profile of dyslexia. And we use a report format, which is designed to concisely communicate useful recommendations which are tailored to the individual. So rather than a full diagnostic report, we're looking at, when we do carry out assessments and write a report, we're looking at making sure it's a really useful, workable report, often with recommendations that have been discussed with and agreed with schools. So we're going to, in the next part of this webinar, talk a little bit more about some questions, some of the sorts of things that we get asked by parents and carers and schools. So hopefully we may answer some of your questions as we go through the next part of this webinar. And the next one is one for Rachel.
Thanks, Alison. So we often get asked this question, who can identify dyslexia? It's also often asked of teachers and Senkos within school. It's a very common question. And as Alison said earlier, dyslexia is an educational identification and not a medical diagnosis. So you would not go to a medical professional such as the doctor to seek a diagnosis. And we know that, people often do go to the doctor to ask about dyslexia and a diagnosis, and the NHS even have a web page about dyslexia as well, and it's not surprising that people do, because we use that term sometimes, diagnosis, and it's very commonly used, and we associate that with the medical diagnosis. So if it's not medical and it can't be identified by a medical profession, who does then? So it can be identified either by a chartered educational psychologist or a specialist teacher who is suitably qualified, and that would be a teacher who has a level 7 qualification in the assessment and teaching for those with dyslexia. Quite often we call this AMDA because they might hold associate membership of the associate membership of the British Dyslexia Association, but there are also other organisations that they may belong to as well. And many specialist teachers will hold something called an assessment practicing certificate, which also shows that they've met a certain level of quality assurance in terms of the style in which they write their reports, and that they're up to date as well. So although these people can identify dyslexia formally, teachers in school are actually really, really well placed to identify many of the indicators of dyslexia and to recognise the needs of children and put in place appropriate intervention in response to their observations. So the key message here is that we don't wait for a formal identification in order to put help and support in place. So if we move to the next question, here's one for Alison.
Thank you. Yes, we get asked this question quite a lot. When can dyslexia be identified? Well, for some children, dyslexia can be identified at an early age. For other children, it becomes much more evident as they develop and progress through school. And as we mentioned earlier, every child and young person, everybody who's dyslexic is different. So similarly, dyslexia is likely to look a little bit different for everybody. It also depends on how the child or young person responds to the support, and that can be a further indication, as I mentioned earlier as well. Essentially, and this is really important, children and young people should be supported as soon as they need it. It's not necessary to wait until dyslexia is identified before intervention or support can begin. So as soon as we spot, or as teachers or school professionals, spot signs that a child might need a little bit of extra help, following that graduated approach, we would start to be putting in support or intervention as soon as it's needed. While signs of dyslexia might be apparent in Key Stage 1, formal assessment might be more likely to be accurate and useful from Key Stage 2. So that tends to be from children from about the age of 7. But that doesn't mean to say we can't spot signs of dyslexia for younger children. And as I said earlier, we definitely, if we spot signs that a child needs help, we need to be supporting those things as early as possible. And crucially, it's not about waiting for a child to fail. There's lots of early support and intervention for children in Key Stage 1. such as, for example, using the phonic check. All children in maintained schools will take part in the Year 1 phonic check. And we often think about, well, let's use that information. If a child has found that difficult, that's telling us something. And let's use that information to then give us more information about what we might need to do next. So schools may use that information to then put in place, for example, in Wiltshire, our Westford programme. That's our Wiltshire Early Support for Dyslexia programme, which includes a phonological skills programme that can be introduced and used with children from about Year 1 and is designed to really strengthen those underlying phonological skills that are needed. If we move to the next slide, Rachel might be able to answer our next question.
So we often get asked this question, I think my child may be dyslexic, how can school help? And as we've already said, schools are very well placed to identify and respond to pupils' needs as part of the graduated response that Alison talked about, which is embedded in the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice. So it should be business as usual. Schools are very used to supporting children with learning needs. And as Alison said, we encourage schools to use lots of resources that are freely available, resources from Wiltshire Council, resources from elsewhere as well. And one of the things that we have that's a more recent development, in addition, is something that we call OPAL, which is a document which outlines ordinarily available provisions. So it's what schools are expected to offer as part of their offer to everybody, and you can find that on the Wiltshire Council local offer, and it's a really helpful document for parents as well as schools. So initially, schools will make reasonable adjustments within the classroom. Teachers do lots day in, day out, that are just tiny little tweaks to what they're doing. We call it adaptive teaching, where they might be questioning perhaps in a slightly different way, or they might be scaffolding a task for a child, just giving a little bit of additional support. And quite often those little adjustments are almost invisible. They're seamless. They just happen through what the teacher's doing as part and parcel of their everyday job. But sometimes a little bit more is needed. And if schools need additional support or ideas, they can refer to our team via our SENS helpline. They can ask for a SENS surgery or put in a referral. And we provide schools with advice. And sometimes, as Alison said, we might carry out some assessments for pupils as well to find out more about their profile as a learner. And we're happy to discuss when a pupil has a dyslexic profile, and we may give advice to support their learning. If parents want a full formal identification of dyslexia, though, private assessor lists are available via the British Dyslexia Association and the PATOS websites. And that's where you can find an assessor who should hold the appropriate qualification. And so if we move on to the next slide, Alison will answer the next question that we have.
Thank you. So often following on from that, we get asked, so when are specialists such as educational psychologists or specialist teachers involved? And as Rachel mentioned, they're the people who are able to formally identify or diagnose dyslexia. So thinking of those adjustments and interventions that schools can put in place for young people, when a child or young person makes limited progress from their starting point, despite good practice and evidence-based SEND support and interventions, using that graduated approach of assess, plan, do, review that I mentioned earlier, the school should then consider involving specialists as quickly as practical and possible. And of course, parents, carers must be involved in any decision involving specialists. Schools can draw on their own specialists, So some schools will have their own specialist teachers. Quite a lot of our secondary schools will have access to specialist teachers or members of staff who are specialist teachers, and some of our primary schools too. But in Wiltshire, as I mentioned earlier, all schools are able to access, all maintained schools are able to access our team. Within the cognition and learning parts of our team, we some of us have additional qualifications. The level 7 dyslexia qualifications that Rachel mentioned. So schools are able to refer to our service for further advice if they need to. The identification of needs, though, recognises that every dyslexic profile can be very different, and we would recognise that, and we would want the schools to recognise too. So recognising that every child, young person, even though they might still be dyslexic, that's going to be different for different people, and that's going to be really important. Something else we would say is that we would advise that any identification of dyslexia needs to be understood by everybody involved, and especially by the child or the young person and their parent carers. And importantly, the identification of learning differences is best when it's carried out alongside school, so that we can be seeing children within that school context to get a picture of how they respond to learning, to help inform us more, and also then to help discuss with the school the sort of adjustments or recommendations of things that the school can do that are more likely to be practical for the school, and things that school can realistically put in place effectively for the young person. So moving on to the next slide. The next slide for Rachel is whether the child needs a full diagnostic assessment.
So this is another question that we often get asked, and while a full assessment can be really valuable, a formal identification of dyslexia is not always needed to access support in school. As Alison said earlier, the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice promotes a needs-led approach rather than a diagnosis-led approach. So what this means is that a child should be supported as soon as difficulties become apparent. So for example, if they're struggling with phonics, we would expect additional phonics support to be put in place to help them learn their phonics. Schools will collate evidence of children's normal way of working and will conduct their own assessments for GCSE access arrangements, such as for additional time. And primary school staff will also collate evidence of adjustments that might be needed for their SATs exams. So in terms of whether an assessment might be needed for access arrangements, which is again a question that we often get asked about, it's not needed for that either. It can be helpful, it can contain some useful information, but it's not needed for a child to get the support within school. It's also not needed in order to apply for an EHCP. And that's another question that we often get asked, and something that parents sometimes worry about. So even when a child has a full assessment and has been found to be dyslexic, it doesn't mean that that child will automatically qualify for access arrangements or be eligible for an education and healthcare plan, or EHCP. So we understand that sometimes parents do seek an independent assessment, and when they do contain lots of helpful information. So we always recommend that school staff would refer to that information and use it where possible. And moving on to the next slide, our last of these questions is for Alison.
Thank you. So this is a question, again, that we often are asked, and people often will think that, oh, well, now we have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, we've got all the answers, and we now know how to teach the child or young person, and certainly assessments can be really useful. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but they can give us lots more information. But do children with dyslexia needs to be taught differently? Well, the short answer to this question is no, not necessarily. And many of the really effective approaches and interventions that we'll use for children with literacy difficulties in school are effective for children with dyslexia. So often it's not that we will be pulling out a different approach or scheme or intervention for a child with dyslexia as opposed to a child with literacy difficulties. It's about using what we know about the young person. It may be about their interests as well that we're going to be building into the support and into the intervention. But often, as I said, the short answer to that is no, we're going to be using those same approaches. And in a moment, we'll give you a snapshot of some of those approaches that schools use. If we go to the next slide, I just really want to stress that whilst assessment can be helpful, and there certainly is a place for assessment, it's what we do that really makes the difference. And as I often think, our plants don't grow any more quickly by keeping measuring them. It's what we do that makes the difference. So for children and young people, lots of assessing isn't going to necessarily help them make progress. It's the way we use the information that we find from those assessments that really has the power to help affect positive outcomes for children and young people. And an example of this is on the next slide, which is our Wiltshire Early Support for Dyslexia, or Westford programme that I mentioned earlier. So, as I said, identifying signs of dyslexia or literacy difficulties is often a key issue for schools and young people. And we have this particular Wiltshire resource that's available to our schools to be used from those early stages within Key Stage 1, from probably about year 1. And we will be encouraging schools, if they feel that they're starting to see that children or a child might be having difficulties with phonics in particular, and early word reading and spelling, we would recommend that they have a look at the Westford programme, and particularly the test of phonological skills, to see whether there may be some underlying difficulties with phonological awareness. And phonological awareness is the feel for patterns of sounds within words. We will be encouraging schools to use that particular resource. And then if they feel from the test of phonological skills that there may be some patterns of difficulties, there's then a phonological skills programme that schools can use to strengthen those skills. And then in the second resource that you can see there, there's a resource file that runs alongside the Westford resource, the Westford document, which includes lots of ideas to support learning for children with literacy difficulties across the curriculum. So we'd be encouraging schools to do that. But we know that our schools use a lot of other tools as well. So they will use standardised assessments. Many of our schools will use standardised reading tests, spelling tests, other perhaps standardised maths tests. They will be using assessments such as the Year 1 phonic check that all our schools, as I mentioned earlier, have to complete. Some of our schools will be using some more commercial programmes to identify or perhaps screen for patterns or indicators of dyslexia. So things like the NESSE programme, schools might be using that, or the IDL programme, they might be using some of those sorts of approaches, and of course using other resources that we provide within our service. So we have a bank of resources that are known as the SEAM document, and that includes lots of resources which are screening resources, so assessments, not standardised, but assessments that school can use, which are going to tell school a little bit more about children's strengths and possible difficulties. So schools will use those, but they'll also use them alongside their observations, alongside their data that looks at pupil progress. So looking at the progress that children are making in reading, their writing, their whether they're reaching age-related expectations and the milestones perhaps that may be expected. And then what's really important is that they use that knowledge to inform how lessons can be adapted, and then put in place intervention using that graduated approach that might be needed. On the next slide, Rachel's going to talk a little bit about listening to what pupils say, because that is a really important part of this whole process.
Thanks, Alison. Absolutely. And this is something that we do strongly promote school staff to do. Find out about what the pupils think about their learning, about what they find difficult, and what helps them as well. And it's something that we do in our role as well. It's really, really important. And we see really good examples of this in schools when school staff work together with pupils on things like creating a pupil passport or a one-page profile, which tells staff within the school about the child's strengths, their difficulties, and what helps. But I'd just really like to share with you a quote from a Year 11 pupil from one of our dyslexia-friendly schools in Wiltshire. She said, "Often it's the little things that make a difference. Knowing a teacher has thought about what you might need, knowing someone is there to talk to if you have worries, and that someone can advocate for you if you don't feel able to do it yourself. It's great when teachers slightly adapt worksheets, simple things, colour coding, text in bold. So you have the same as everyone else, but with slight adaptations to make it work for you, so you don't stand out, but can still do the work." And I thought that was a really lovely example of how a student has been listened to. She's shared what she's found helped, and teachers have put that in place. And if we move to the next slide, this is one of my favourite photos that a dyslexia-friendly school has sent us. And it relates to seeing the difference that comes with dyslexia in a more positive light. And it's about the ethos within the school, recognising that it's okay to learn differently, that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that we sometimes need help, and that's okay. So in this particular school, they did a great piece of work around dyslexia as a superpower. They established dyslexia buddies where pupils could talk to each other. They had a staff member as a dyslexia ambassador. And the school that created this display, they worked around a book called Mission Dyslexia, which had superheroes promoting things like determination, creativity, and perseverance. And they defeated Mr. Dyslexia. And the pupils created their own superhero characters around themselves and their own strengths as well. And it was really a great way of promoting talking about dyslexia and learning differences. And if we move to the next slide.
Thank you.
Thank you. So teachers use their knowledge of pupils to adapt lessons. And as I mentioned earlier, this can be really subtle. Pupils often don't want to be seen as different from their peers. So it might involve things like allowing a bit of extra time for reading or processing information, asking a question in a particular way. It could involve seating arrangements, so opportunities for different groupings depending on the subject or the task. It could involve teachers adapting the resources that they provide. Here we have an example from one of our dyslexia-friendly schools of what they call a help yourself resource box, and these are provided in every one of their classrooms, containing things like word mats, dyslexia-friendly dictionaries, highlighters, scrap paper, multiplication squares, and these are resources that anyone in the class can just go and help themselves to. So there isn't any stigma about having a different resource from anybody else. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to share with you some examples of using assistive technology. So we know for many pupils that using assistive technology is the way forward. We know that in the big wide world, more and more of us are using assistive technology to support us in our day-to-day lives, whether we have dyslexia or not. And many of our Wiltshire schools use assistive technology really effectively. And we actually have some good links here in SENS with assistive technology organisations such as Scanning Pens, who are a company that have created these pens. You can see one on the slide there that the pupil is holding. It's basically an electronic reader pen. So the the child will scan the text with the pen and it will read it to them, and they can either hear that being read out loud, or they can connect a pair of headphones. So it's also very discreet, and it can be used in all of their GCSE examinations without any access arrangements as well, which is amazing. So assistive technology can be used right from the earliest stages. So it can be used at a very simple level with something called a talking tin, which is basically a small device where the child presses a button and they can speak into it, and it records just a few seconds, 30 seconds worth, or 20 seconds or 10 seconds, depending on the one that they have. And then they can listen to it back. And it's really helpful for things like holding on to something that they might forget. Particularly helpful when children are first learning to write and there's so much to think about. So they can say their sentence and then they can play it back as they're trying to write it. But also thinking of assistive technology like tablets, iPads, laptops, etc. These are all things that schools are using in different ways, and often very creative ways as well. One of our dyslexia friendly schools uses QR codes to enable pupils to access feedback. Others use them to help them to access resources, particularly secondary schools, with signposting and links to revision resources. So all of these things can have a real impact. And to think about the impact that assistive technology can have, one of the things Asenko from one of our dyslexia-friendly schools recently said was, I think for me, what has been the most effective thing this year and last is the technology options. And it's made a huge difference, in particular to a group of pupils who now use them independently. She was talking about the scanning pens in all subjects. They're achieving expected or above expected and are independent. And if we move to the next slide, so our Google Gemini. So this is an example of using an AI tool. So this is coming in a little bit more of as a newcomer to the world of assistive technology to support in the classroom. But where we found it particularly useful is for teachers to be able to adjust a text very, very easily. So perhaps to create a summary, or to adjust the reading age of a text. So the reading age of the text might be, say, 15 years old, and they want to bring it down to perhaps 9 years old. And that can be done much more easily using artificial intelligence such as Google Gemini than the teacher spending ages trying to do that themselves. It can be used for organising ideas and planning to help get started with writing. Obviously, we don't advocate using it to completely write for the child, because we still want children to come up with their own ideas and have that creative experience. But it is a helpful tool, and of course it can also help with things like checking spelling, punctuation and grammar in the same way as perhaps a more conventional tool can within a program such as Word. But it's certainly a new area that many schools are starting to explore as well. And if we go to the next slide, here's another example of use of assistive technology. And this is called Immersive Reader. It's a free tool available within Microsoft Office. And all children who are in UK secondary schools have a license with Microsoft that would enable them to use Immersive Reader in the online version of Microsoft Office. But our primary schools can use it too, because there's also a desktop version of it as well. It's a little bit more simple than the online version, but that's not a problem. It has lots of accessibility features built into it. So you can see from the example there a coloured background, but the text is put into a slightly easier to read format. So you can see the spacing, it's nicely spaced out. You can change the size of the font. You can change the spacing of it so that it can be broken down into syllables, which helps some children as well. But the most important thing is that it reads it out loud. So what it does as it reads it out loud is it highlights the word. So you can see that on that example, there's one word that's being highlighted. So that would be the word being read at that time. So children can read along with Immersive Reader, and it even has a reading coach function as well. And then there are other parts too where you can, in the online version, where you can highlight parts of speech, so like highlight all of the nouns and highlight all of the adjectives or verbs and things like that. So it's a really, really helpful tool. And where we found it work really effectively for children is where they've been able to perhaps dictate their writing and then listen back to it by using the computer reader with Immersive Reader. So it's really, really powerful. And I keep saying it's within Microsoft, but actually there is a version available on iOS as well for those people that are using iPads. It's not called Immersive Reader, but there's the same function within iPads as well, essentially. And if we move to the next slide, Alison is going to talk a little bit about developing metacognition.
Thank you, Rachel. So metacognition is something that our schools really focus on, and we do encourage our schools to think about. Metacognition essentially means learning about learning, and developing a pupil's awareness of their own learning, so helping them develop strategies they can use to support themselves is really important. We often feel for children who have special educational needs that they need to have a one-to-one adult working with them or a teaching assistant. And sometimes that can be really helpful, but often it may not be needed, and sometimes it's not helpful. And research does tell us that sometimes it's not always a helpful thing to put in place. Developing children's understanding of themselves as learners, so developing their metacognition, is more effective, and that's really powerful, and it does help children to become more independent, which is of course what we're all aiming for. Where children are supported by adults within school and within class, it's best when we think about the way we support children as a scaffold. So we'll often talk about scaffolded approaches. So enabling the pupil to move from a position where they're supported to a position where they're able to do something independently. So crucially, not doing everything for the child, helping them understand more about what they can do to help themselves. And then that way the child understands more about learning, more about the learning process. We know that the most effective learners have really good metacognition. And so by developing that, similarly, we're really helping encourage and develop children's learning. And what we know is that developing awareness of themselves as learners is really powerful. If we move to the next slide, I just would like to say a little bit about using evidence-based interventions. And despite really good quality teaching and lessons, we know that sometimes there is a place for additional intervention. What's really important where we put an intervention in place in schools is that we use what the evidence is telling us. So making use of the research that is available. This is something that has really developed and we're a lot more aware of as teachers, particularly I think over the last 10 to 15 years. And now certainly we're all talking about what's the evidence telling us? What do we know about this approach? Is it likely to be effective? Of course, every child, young person is different. And it's also important that we take into account what works for the individual young person and what their interests are and their strengths. So bearing those things in mind too. But what we do know is that we need to be using what research tells us to help us understand what the best sort of interventions are likely to be for when we're thinking about dyslexia. and we do have a much better understanding. We also know that interventions tend to work best when they're little and often. So they might be happening perhaps 3 times a week for 20 minutes for each lesson. We also know that interventions that are delivered in small groups can be really effective, and interventions that are delivered by teaching assistants can be really effective. So again, really effective use of teaching assistant time is often delivering those evidence-based targeted interventions. Little and often, we also know that interventions should be time limited. The aim is that they're going to have impact, so they shouldn't be carrying on indefinitely. They might take a little bit of time. We know that, as I said earlier, it might take children a little bit longer to become automatic. So we know we might need to give children time to develop the skills that we're focusing on in intervention lessons. But nevertheless, they shouldn't be carrying on long term. So we wouldn't want them to be going on year after year. That would be telling us something. It would be saying that it doesn't look like it's the right sort of intervention for this young person. They also need to have a clear baseline assessment process so we can see what impact they're having, and using that graduated response, seeing looking at the impact over time. Is it working? Is it having an intervention? Is it having an impact, for example, on a child's reading or their writing or their maths or whatever it is that we may be targeting? So thinking about the evidence-based targeted intervention complementing the good quality teaching, and that good quality teaching is the most important thing. The evidence-based interventions would be an additional on top of those, not instead of good quality teaching. So if we move to the next part of our webinar, we're going to move towards the end by focusing very quickly on some ideas for helping at home. So if I hand over in a moment to Rachel, but before I do, on the next slide, here we are, going to be starting thinking about strengths. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things I would often be saying to parents and carers is, we might be talking about things that your child finds difficult, but focus on their strengths too. I will always ask when I'm working with parents, what's your child good at? What are they interested in? What are they good at? And if you don't know, or if you're not sure, make it your mission to try to find out. Make it your mission, if there's something your child's interested in, help turn it, nurture it, and help turn it into a strength. And really focus on that, because it's those strengths that will balance some of the things your child might find more difficult at school. And it's those strengths that we want your child to really focus on as they move through school and hopefully beyond school as well. On the next slide, I just would like to remind you that, as I mentioned at the beginning, it can take longer for some children to become automatic at learning things. So the key to this is lots of patience. Be aware that it might take much longer to learn some things by heart, to become automatic at doing those things. So patience is the key message there. Rachel's going to mention on our next slide a little bit about hearing and vision.
So these are fundamentals, really. It's just a reminder to keep up with routine eye tests so that any issues are picked up as soon as they become apparent. And similarly, if you have concerns about whether your child can hear well enough, then seek a referral to audiology and just check out whether there are any concerns there. And particularly with younger children who might have had issues with glue ear as well. We know that can sometimes cause problems with learning phonics and speech sounds and things like that. So just to be aware of eyes and ears, just think eyes and ears. And if we move to the next slide, just a focus on reading. Keep reading. Reading with your child is so powerful. It doesn't matter whatever their age is. Don't stop reading together. it's fantastic when we hear children telling us about the bedtime stories that their parents are reading to them. Just because they have started to read, or they can read a little bit, doesn't mean that parents should stop reading to their child. And it doesn't always have to be you either. It could be a grandparent, it could be a friend, it could be an audiobook as well. There are lots of different ways that you can keep your child reading and enjoying books, and that's the key thing here. It's about reading for pleasure. It's about enjoying it, because children who are dyslexic often have a lot of struggle associated with reading. So where possible, we need to find the joy in reading and make it enjoyable for them. So find books and reading material that your child's interested in. And try different things out. It doesn't matter if it's not a book. It could be a comic, a newspaper, etc. Well, not necessarily a newspaper, but a comic or graphic novel, things like that. You know, it doesn't have to be always a school reading book, for example. And if they are struggling to read their school reading book, try an approach such as paired reading, which is something that we often recommend, where parents and children read aloud together at the same time. And you can find lots of information about that online as well, because it's something that's been around for a long time. And if we go to the next slide, we often get asked, you know, about what children should be reading. What do we read? And yes, lots of children have a reading book that comes home from school, but it doesn't have to be limited to reading that. They could be listening to stories that they might not be able to read. They could be reading fiction or non-fiction, as I said earlier, comics, books without words, e-books. So they could be listening along, perhaps using immersive reader or an equivalent. They could be reading on a Kindle. There are lots of different ways to access learning. On the slide, you can see a web address for Barrington Stoke, and they're a publisher who publish dyslexia-friendly reading materials. So the texts tend to be shorter books, and they're designed to have a higher interest age but a lower reading age, so that children who are struggling with reading are not stuck reading really, really babyish books that aren't really very interesting for them. So certainly look for these sorts of books. So Barrington Stoke is the obvious example because they were the first, but there are others, and these types of books are called high-low books. So that they're ones to look for, and there are lots within the Wiltshire Library Service. So you can go to your local library, and if they don't have any that your child wants to read on the shelf, they can easily get them in for you as well from other libraries across Wiltshire. And if we move to the next slide, make use of Wiltshire Libraries. It's free. Your child can access so many books for free. They can change their book if they're not that interested in it. If they've chosen a book and you've bought it, you feel much more invested in it. But in the library, you can choose lots of different things, or rather, they can choose lots of different things, and try out different books. Some of them they'll like, some of them they won't. There's a lovely poster called The Rights of the Reader, and one of the things on there is the right to pick up a book and read it, the right to put it down and not read it. And as I said, there's lots of material there, and lots of very knowledgeable librarians as well, who can really help. And one thing that many people don't always realise is that the Wiltshire Library Service also have a large range of ebooks and audiobooks and e-magazines that they can lend out as well. And if we move to the next slide. So thinking about supporting with technology at home. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about different ways in which schools support children with the use of assistive technology. And there will be some things that I'm sure you're using within the home. Many older children particularly have their own phones, and certainly a lot of teenagers already dictate voice messages, etc., into their phones. But if you want to find out more about how technology can be used to support them. There's a really helpful website on the slide here called www.callscotland.org.uk, and they provide lots of help sheets on how to use different things, including some of the things that I mentioned earlier. It's a really useful site, both for parents and teachers and individuals as well. So do have a look at it. And then to the next slide. We have homework. So just a few top tips for you to use at home to support homework. It's really important that children feel calm when they're approaching their homework, especially if it's something that is challenging for them. So create a calm environment. Some children find it helpful to do it at the same sort of time and to find a routine for it. Others have to be in the right kind of mood. You have to catch them at the right moment, if you like. But try and be positive about it and not talk about it as if it's always a chore. So try to be positive about them completing their homework. Help them to break the tasks down if you can. Chunk them into smaller parts. So a little bit of a win after each bit that's completed. They might like to take a little bit of a movement break in between the different parts that they complete. And support their reading and recording. It's okay. It's okay to support them with that. And do communicate with teachers when children are struggling with their homework, and talk about how best you can support them with the teacher, and suggest what you think might help yourself to the teacher. Would it be okay if we do this? And lots of teachers are very happy to engage in those sorts of conversations. And finally, make it come to life. Anything that relates to children's own experiences of life can really help them to understand it and process it more easily. And that's definitely the case for children with dyslexia and literacy difficulties, but it's often the case for all children, really. So just a few ideas around supporting homework. And I'm just going to hand over to Alison, who's going to talk a little bit about encouraging self-esteem.
Thank you. So as we come to the end of this part of the webinar, just as I really would like to mention encouraging self-esteem. So just as I mentioned, focusing on strengths, a real takeaway message for you this evening is to really focus on encouraging your child's self-esteem, including self-esteem as a learner. One of the messages that I often really try to get across to children and young people, one of the things I often say is, we all have things we're good at. We all need a little bit of help sometimes. We're all different. We all learn differently. And that's okay. Actually, difference is okay. It's more than okay. It's good. We need difference. It's important. So that message is a takeaway message for you this evening, and something to be thinking about, and trying to help your child understand that it's okay to learn in a different way. Sometimes things might be hard, but balancing that with strengths and seeing learning differently is okay, is a good thing. And there's some lovely resources that you can go to. Rachel has put on the screen here for us a couple of resources. One is from the website Made by Dyslexia. So lots of resources on there for parents, carers, school staff and children and young people themselves. And another lovely resource is the video, which is available on YouTube, from the British Dyslexia Association about seeing dyslexia differently. So they're two really lovely resources that you might want to have a little look at to really help encourage your child's self-esteem, including self-esteem as a learner. So as we come to the very final part of our webinar, we're just going to mention very, very quickly where to go to for further information. And on our next slide, you can see we have lots of places that you can go to in Wiltshire, including our local offer, which is, if we move to the next slide, you'll be able to see a little bit about what that looks like. Thank you. So on our Wiltshire local offer site, there is information about our dyslexia friendly schools in Wiltshire, our Wiltshire dyslexia leaflet. So it has everything in there that we've talked about this evening, a little bit more about what we say about dyslexia in Wiltshire. We have send newsletters that are sent out and available for parents and carers regularly, and also the OPAL information that Rachel mentioned earlier. So that's the ordinarily available provision for all learners, and particularly the cognition and learning section will have information about dyslexia. If we go to the next slide, I'd also like to mention another really useful place you may like to go to for further support and to be aware of. In Wiltshire, we have an organisation called the Wiltshire Parent Carer Council, or also the WPCC. And the Wiltshire Parent Carer Council are here for parent carers of children and young people with any special educational needs or disability. And the child doesn't need to have a diagnosis to access support or to contact the WPCC. If we go to the next slide, we can see there a little bit more about the WPCC. They have a newsletter that they send out regularly, and parent carers can sign up for their free weekly newsletter. And professionals are also very welcome to contact the WPCC as they have separate weekly emails with information for professionals and school staff. We'll move on to the next slide. We'd also like to mention the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association. Rachel's going to say a few words about our super Wiltshire Dyslexia Association, who we're very lucky to have.
Yes, so the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association are very active, but very small charity, but affiliated to the British Dyslexia Association. And they have a helpline that parents can call if they want to seek advice and discuss a particular situation. But they also provide lots of information to support not just children, but also adults with dyslexia as well. And they have a Facebook page that if you want to go to, you can check that out and look at perhaps joining. Once you join, and it's a very small annual fee, you will get a monthly newsletter, and this monthly newsletter is about 30 or 40 pages long most months, and it contains links to lots of helpful information, signposting to free webinars and interesting resources and articles, lots and lots of information. So it's great, and they will be at our dyslexia awareness drop-in event, which is next week, and we'll tell you just a little bit about that before we go as well. So if we move to the next slide, here's some information on how to get hold of the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association, and a few of the things that they do. And if we move to the next slide, so the British Dyslexia Association, as I said, the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association are affiliated with the British Dyslexia Association, and their website contains lots of additional information, and I'm sure many of you will already be aware of the British Dyslexia Association, but just a couple of things that might be helpful: the guide for parents, and also their resources list as well. And they also have lots of free webinars which are available to download on their YouTube channel as well. And so finally, that brings us to information about our drop-in event. It's a dyslexia awareness drop-in event next Thursday, so Thursday the 17th of October, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Everyone is welcome, so parents, carers, but also individuals with dyslexia as well. And we're holding this in the atrium at County Hall in Trowbridge. You can come along, have a look at a range of resources and find out about the support available for schools and families in Wiltshire. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the list of confirmed exhibitors. So SENS, we will be there, along with the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association, the WPCC, Wiltshire Libraries, Wiltshire Learning Resources Hub and the Wiltshire Family Community Learning. And then we've also got a whole range of commercial providers as well, including many who are sharing information about assistive technology, and lots of providers there who sell products that you might be interested in having a look at. And some of these might be things that your children would find helpful, or maybe already being used in school. So do come along. If you'd like to come and chat to us, we will be there and happy to talk to people. But come along and have a look at the stands as well. And finally, we get to the last slide. I'd like to say thank you for listening. If you're not able to attend the drop-in event next week and you'd like to find out more, or if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at the email address on the screen, dfs@wiltshire.gov.uk. So finally, thank you for listening. We hope that we've shared some ideas and sources of support with you this evening that you found helpful. Please remember that you're welcome to contact us for more information if there's anything we can help with.
And just some final food for thought. Thank you again. Take away from this evening, try to find out about, we need to try and find out about children and their strengths, focus and celebrate what they're good at, and help them find ways around some of the things that they find more difficult. And then hopefully trying to find ways forward for them. Thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and the webinar will now finish.